How is it possible that Africa, with so much wealth beneath its soil, such generous natural resources, and an abundance of water and sunlight, remains the poorest continent in the world? In July 2023, that rhetorical question was posed in St. Petersburg by Captain Ibrahim Traoré, then just 35 years old and 10 months into his rule of Burkina Faso. It was meant to justify his country's pivot toward Russia and its increasingly confrontational break with Europe. In the space of only a few years, 3 Sahelian states, Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger, expelled French troops, rejected the existing regional order, and proclaimed the restoration of their sovereignty. They were supposed to finally defeat terrorism on their own, a threat the West had spent a decade failing to bring under control. And so the French were replaced by the Russians. First Wagner mercenaries, then the Kremlin-controlled Afrika Korps. The result? Today jihadist groups are seizing ever more territory. The Juntas control less and less of their own countries, while Russian forces are suffering their heaviest losses in Africa since Moscow began expanding across the continent. At the same time, gold mined under Russian protection is being routed through the Middle East onto global markets, helping finance the Kremlin's war machine. If Traoré is still searching for an answer to his question, his own policies provide much of it. The Sahel has become the point where 3 conflicts converge: the struggle for power in Africa, the expansion of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, and Russia's confrontation with the West. Their consequences may soon reach far closer to Europe than many currently assume. Why did replacing one set of partners fail to change anything, and instead made the situation even worse? Let's find out. The alliance of Sahel states was meant to be a new beginning. But after removing Western troops, leaving ECOWAS and turning to Russia, the region is no safer than before. Jihadist groups now control more rural territory than ever and are pushing toward capital cities. Russia and Jainim are fighting each other, yet both are feeding off the same thing: failing states and the absence of any coherent international strategy. Changes in political alliances, resource control and regional stability can influence financial markets, which is why I believe it is worth following not only the markets themselves, but also the events shaping them. That is one of the main reasons I use XTB, the partner of this channel and a place where I manage my own investments. The platform gives me access to over 11,700 instruments from markets around the world, including companies across the energy, industrial and technology sectors. XTB platform also offers real stocks and ETFs with 0% commission, up to equivalent to €100,000 monthly turnover. Above 0.2% commission applies. XTB also offers retirement accounts in selected markets that may provide tax advantages. The financial instruments offered involve risk. Invest responsibly. It all began with a series of coups, and their pace says more than the dates alone. In Mali, the military seized power in August 2020. Less than a year later, in May 2021, the same group of officers overthrew its own transitional government, with Colonel Assimi Goïta emerging as the country's leader. In Burkina Faso, 2022 brought 2 coups just 8 months apart, one in January and another in September, after which the country came under the rule of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, then just 34 years old. In Niger, the elected government was overthrown in July 2023 and President Mohamed Bazoum remains in detention to this day. 5 successful coups in 3 countries in the space of 3 years. What drove these coups? Each time the military offered the same justification. Civilian politicians were failing to contain terrorism, were too dependent on Paris, and were incapable of restoring control over their own territory. The new regimes soon discovered that they had more in common with one another than with anyone else. Their borders converge at a single point: the Liptako-Gourma region, where Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger meet. It was also where jihadist groups were strongest. Each junta were therefore fighting the same war against the same enemy in the same place. All three were also diplomatically isolated and needed a partner that would not ask when elections were due. The first result was a mutual defense pact. In September 2023, the three regimes signed the Liptako-Gourma Charter, pledging that an attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. In July 2024, they went further, transforming that arrangement into a confederation called Alliance des États du Sahel, or the Alliance of Sahel States, AES for short. It was designed to coordinate not only defense but also foreign and economic policy, with a rotating presidency and plans for a common currency. Only after putting that structure in place did Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger withdraw from ECOWAS, the economic community of West African countries, which at the time brought together 15 countries and had served for nearly half a century as the region's main political arbiter and a guardian of constitutional order. Their withdrawal formally took effect on January 29, 2025. The juntas did not leave the regional bloc and only then began searching for an alternative. They built the alternative first and withdrew from a position of security. Interestingly, ECOWAS, which now comprises 12 West African states, kept some travel and trade arrangements in place because an immediate rupture would have hurt ordinary people far more than the military leadership. More importantly, however, after the coup in Niger, ECOWAS threatened military intervention. And that was initially the plan. But the attack never came. An organization that had spent decades building its authority as the region's political arbiter proved unable to enforce its own ultimatum. That was the moment the juntas realized that the cost of living was lower than they had assumed. Yet withdrawal from ECOWAS was only one of two major ruptures, and not the more consequential one. Upon taking power, each junta demanded the departure of French troops. Mali in 2022, Burkina Faso in early 2023, and Niger soon afterward. Within 2 years, an entire security architecture built over a decade disappeared from the region. Bases, air power, intelligence capabilities, and command structures. The juntas presented this as the restoration of sovereignty. But how valuable was the system they expelled in practice? To answer that, we need to go back a decade, to the moment when France entered the Sahel as the solution, rather than the problem. France entered Mali in January 2013 with Operation Serval. The immediate objective was clear: stop jihadist columns advancing south before they reached Bamako. And it worked. Within weeks, French forces recaptured Timbuktu, Gao and Kidal, dismantling the rear bases of groups linked to Al-Qaeda. But military success did not produce a political settlement. In 2014, Serval was therefore replaced by Operation Barkhane, which expanded across 5 countries: Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso and Mauritania. The scale was formidable. At its peak, Barkhane deployed around 5,000 French troops, supported by regional armies as well as European and American partners with combat aircraft, Reaper drones and a full intelligence and reconnaissance network. The annual cost was 1 billion euros. It was France's largest military operation in Africa since decolonization, sustained for 9 years. Yet the junta's propaganda was not entirely fabricated. Barkhane delivered tactical successes. Commanders were eliminated, equipment destroyed, and militants' freedom of movement constrained. In 2020 alone, the French reported neutralizing more than 1,200 terrorists. And yet, over 9 years of operations, violence in the Sahel did not decline. It increased. Consider the data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, one of the world's oldest conflict databases. In 2013, the year France intervened, Organized violence killed 900 people across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. By 2019, the figure had risen to nearly 3,000. In 2022, the year France withdrew from Mali, it exceeded 7,000. Over the same period, the number of lethal incidents rose from 89 to 1,300. Burkina Faso is a particularly striking case. In 2013, not a single person in the country was killed in this kind of violence. Not one. Today, Burkina Faso is the bloodiest of the three states, with more than 4,000 deaths a year and the second place worldwide in the global terrorism index. 5,000 troops, 1 billion euros a year, and a decade of military presence left the region less secure than it had been at the outset. The juntas could therefore tell their societies something that sounded perfectly reasonable. If the French cannot stop the violence, why should they remain? The problem was that soldiers could retake a town, but they could not replace the state administration, courts, or local security services. A recaptured village would fall back under jihadist control as soon as the military column moved on, because nothing remained behind. No officials, no judge, no police post. The tactics could be effective, yet stabilization was nowhere to be seen. Barkhane was supposed to remain outside Malian politics, but that proved impossible. The operation became a protective umbrella for elites in Bamako, who benefited from foreign support while carrying out no meaningful reforms. There was also a deeper misunderstanding that Paris never resolved. Malians could not understand why French forces fought jihadists but did not deal with Tuareg separatists in the north. For Bamako it was one war, for Paris they were two different conflicts. And so Russian propaganda moved into that gap, arguing that the French presence served only to preserve French influence. Eventually, France was being openly accused of committing genocide against Malians. And there was also the France's own human cost. Dozens of soldiers killed, a price French politicians are still forced to defend today. France's withdrawal brought a long counter-terrorism campaign to an end. It also marked the collapse of an ineffective effort that had nevertheless possessed enormous military capacity. Air power, intelligence, transport, and command experience all disappeared, capabilities the Sahelian armies could not replace. Mali also demanded the termination of MINUSMA, whose mandate expired in 2023. The UN mission did not conduct offensive operations against Jainim, the Sahelian branch of Al-Qaeda, but it maintained a presence in areas where the state had all but vanished. Its departure created yet another vacuum. The G5 Sahel also collapsed, a regional security framework bringing together Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. Built up since 2014, European Union training missions came to an end. Niger also expelled American forces, costing Washington its drone base in Agadez, the only site in the Sahara from which the entire central Sahel could be monitored from the air. The base had cost $100 million to build and was abandoned after just 7 years. The old model was far from perfect, but it was still much better than what came next. In a sense, the alliance of Sahel states did achieve a political success. The three juntas survived regional pressure, jointly resisted demands for a return to constitutional rule, and built a powerful narrative around the restoration of sovereignty. The Confederation cannot be dismissed as a purely propaganda project. Its members coordinate some decisions, are developing joint forces, and increasingly act together in relations with foreign partners. In 2025, they created a joint force of 5,000 troops. That does not mean they have established a unified system of command, intelligence, and border control, but it does represent a certain degree of military capacity. Yet after the French withdrawal, the reality is that the security balance is far worse than it was years ago. The juntas won the argument over who should determine their policies, but ordinary citizens lost, and the state itself lost. The regimes still control the capitals, most major cities and the main military bases. Meanwhile, Jnim and Islamic State in the Sahel have expanded their networks across rural areas. They control routes, impose taxes, blockade towns, and determine access to local markets. This is the central paradox of military rule in the Sahel. The louder the juntas speak about sovereignty, the less control they exercise over their own territory. At present, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger each control no more than roughly half of their national territory. And who thrives in places defined by security vacuums, collapsing authority, and the erosion of state control? The Russian Federation, of course. At first, Russia's main instrument was the Wagner Group, which offered the juntas protection, training, and direct participation in military operations, in exchange for political influence and access to markets and natural resources. It is worth pausing here because the business model contains a built-in contradiction. The mercenaries had no interest in building the independent, defensive capacity of their clients. Quite the opposite. Prolonged insecurity justified their presence and created the basis for further contracts. In the Sahel, Russia profits from the very instability it claims to be fighting. And so after Prigozhin's death, Moscow began formalizing these structures and bringing them under the control of the Defense Ministry and military intelligence. In Mali, Wagner was replaced by the Africa Corps, but the change of name did not mark the end of Russia's presence. Instead, Moscow assumed greater responsibility for operations that had previously been presented as the work of a private company. In July 2026, Russia and the AES states once again pledged to deepen military cooperation, even as jihadist groups continued to gain ground. And this brings us to a point that must be stated plainly. Mali is now the Russian Federation's main war front in Africa. Nowhere else on the continent are Russian forces engaged on this scale. In the Central African Republic, they guard the presidential palace and mining sites. In Sudan, they trade with both sides in the civil war. In Mozambique, Wagner tried to fight, suffered losses, and withdrew after only a few months. Mali is different. Russian columns leave their bases alongside the Malian army, assault towns, conduct operations in the desert hundreds of kilometers from their logistical hubs, and die there. One episode from July 2024 illustrates this better than anything else. A column of Malian troops and Wagner fighters was moving toward Tinzaouaten near the Algerian border, as part of what Bamako described as a stabilization operation. The convoy was ambushed by Tuareg rebels and they attacked again during its retreat, this time by Jnim fighters. The battle lasted 4 days amid a sandstorm. Depending on the source, estimates put the Russian losses at between roughly 40 and 84 soldiers. Even the most conservative figure would make it the deadliest single loss suffered by Russian forces in Africa. For comparison, France lost 59 soldiers over nearly a decade of war in Mali. There is another detail worth noting. 8 months earlier, the same Wagner fighters had captured Kindal alongside the Malian army and raised their own flag over the city for a commemorative photograph. For months afterward, they mocked the Tuaregs on Telegram. Among those killed near Tinzaouaten was the man who ran that Telegram channel. Then in spring of 2026, a coordinated offensive by Jnim and Tuareg rebels inflicted further heavy losses on Malian and Russian forces, while the Africa Corps confirmed its withdrawal from Kidal. The symbolism of the location is hard to miss. Kidal was one of the cities retaken by French forces in 2013 at the start of Operation Serval. 13 years later, Russian troops, brought in to do the job better, were leaving it behind. Mali has therefore become a test of Russian credibility. If Moscow cannot stabilize the country where it is most heavily engaged, and for which it has officially assumed responsibility since 2023, it will struggle to present its model as a more effective alternative to the West, not only in the Sahel. Russia can supply weapons, ammunition, helicopters and instructors. It can carry out brutal operations and help defend key bases. But it cannot replace a functioning state. Worse still, violence against civilians, particularly Fulani and Tuareg communities, drives more people to seek protection or revenge through armed groups. In recent years, the security forces of Mali and Burkina Faso have been responsible for more civilian deaths than the jihadists, while the Malian military's use of Turkish drones has also coincided with a rise in strikes on civilians. It may therefore seem that Russia is simply losing in the Sahel, but the real question is different. What does Moscow consider a victory in Mali? If the measure is national security, then yes, the record is disastrous. But if the measure is influence in the capital, access to mines, and revenue flowing eastward, then Russia is executing its strategy almost perfectly. At stake is access to gold, lithium, and other natural resources. The model is not new. Russia developed it earlier in the Central African Republic and Sudan, by combining military services with mining concessions, mine security, control over transport routes, and brokerage in export markets. Moscow does not need to own the deposit outright. Formal ownership attracts attention and can be targeted by sanctions. It is enough to control the elements without which the deposit is worthless: the license, security for the extraction site, and the route to the market. The mine can remain Malian on paper, but what matters is who decides whether it operates at all, and where the trucks can go once they leave. The Kremlin may earn more than $1 billion a year from African mineral extraction, while estimates for Mali, Sudan, and the Central African Republic combined have reached roughly $2.5 billion. These figures are approximate, because much of the trade takes place outside official statistics. But the central conclusion remains unchanged. African gold helps Russia evade sanctions and finance activities linked to its war against Ukraine. So where does Malian Russian gold go? To the Middle East. Gold leaves the Sahel for the United Arab Emirates, which remains the main entry point for undeclared bullion from across Africa. There it is melted down and mixed with metal from legitimate sources. Once a bar leaves the refinery, it no longer carries any trace of its African origin. It is simply gold, ready to be sold to anyone, anywhere. From there, some of it reaches European markets, including Switzerland. In other words, gold mined under the protection of Russian mercenaries is laundered in the Gulf and purchased in Europe. The problem is not extraction alone. It is that no one along the chain asks where the gold came from. Africa, Russia, and Ukraine are therefore part of the same system. Russian forces help preserve friendly governments and secure access to resources. The profits strengthen Russia's war economy, while Moscow's political presence helps it win support, or at least neutrality, from African states in international forums. In this way, events in Mali affect, among other things, the security of NATO's entire eastern flank. But so far we have viewed the Sahel from above, through the struggle to fill the vacuum left by the West, at the level of capitals, contracts, and mines. But there are other forces operating inside that vacuum, entering from a completely different direction. Not through presidential palaces, but through villages, markets, and pastoral routes. And unlike the Russians, these actors do not need to persuade anyone that they are winning. One only has to look at the map. To understand what we are dealing with, however, we need to go back and much further than the recent coups. Let's return to Algeria's civil war in the 1990s. One of the conflict's most radical factions, the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, was defeated by the Algerian army and reinvented itself in 2007 as Al-Qaeda's regional affiliate, adopting the name Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Pushed out of Algeria, it shifted its operations southward, exploiting the chaos that followed Gaddafi's fall and the power vacuum across Mali's Sahara. In 2012, Islamist militants proclaimed their own emirate there. A year later, France's Operation Serval shattered the emirate, but the organization was not destroyed, it was fragmented. Its component groups survived for 4 years in dispersed form before reassembling in March 2017 under a single banner, Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, or the Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims. It brought together Ansar Din, the Masina Liberation Front, Al-Murad Bitun, and Akim's Saharan branches. Two developments directly drove this confrontation: the prolonged war against France and the emergence of a regional rival in the form of Islamic State. Today, JNIM is Al-Qaeda's most important organization in the Central Sahel. The US National Counterterrorism Center estimates that it has at least 6,000 members operating from northern Mali to the borderlands of Benin and Togo. 6,000 fighters may not sound like many. The Malian army alone is several times larger, and once the forces of Burkina Faso, Niger and Russia are included, the state's numerical advantage appears overwhelming. So what explains JNIM's effectiveness? The answer is that JNIM is not a single army, but a federation. From the outset, it retained a decentralized structure, and this is its greatest strength. Each component operates in its own territory, drawing on its own understanding of local disputes. The most active is Katiba Masina, which has expanded its influence across central and southern Mali by inserting itself into the centuries-long conflict between herders and farmers. In northern Burkina Faso, Ansarul Islam plays a similar role. Further east, other branches are driving expansion toward Niger, Benin and Togo. JNIM's strength, therefore, does not come from the number of its fighters or from Al-Qaeda's ideology alone. It comes from the organization's ability to connect the ideology to local interests, to smuggling, land disputes, and grievances the state has never resolved. Al-Qaeda provides the banner and the money. The Sahel provides the rest. That is why it would be a mistake to measure JNIM's success by the number of capitals or major cities it captures. JNIM does not need to seize Bamako, Ouagadougou or Niamey. It can surround smaller towns, destroy infrastructure, block fuel deliveries, and force military garrisons to remain behind the walls of their bases. The state may formally retain control of a town while controlling neither the roads leading into it nor the surrounding villages. For the same reason, a decline in the number of attacks does not always indicate improvement. Sometimes it means the organization no longer needs to fight because the state administration has already been driven out and the local population has accepted the rules imposed upon it. Its most dangerous ability, however, is to attach itself to other people's conflicts. Consider the Fulani, nomadic herders spread across the Sahel who have been locked in disputes with settled farmers over access to land and water for decades. Equating the Fulani community with jihadism would be absurd, but the JNIM recruits among those who feel threatened by the army, local militias, or neighboring communities. It does not need to convince them to embrace global jihad. It only needs to be the sole actor offering protection. The same applies to the Tuaregs. Northern separatists are not part of Al-Qaeda and seek something entirely different, a state of their own, not a caliphate. Under certain conditions, however, they are capable of coordinating with JNIM against a common enemy. We saw this during the 2026 offensive, the same campaign after which Russian forces withdrew from Kidal. This is precisely what makes the conflict in the Sahel so difficult. The Juntas portray it as a straightforward struggle between the state and terrorists. In reality, it is an overlapping set of conflicts over power, land, grazing rights, natural resources, and the future of northern Mali. A brutal operation may kill dozens of militants, but if it also destroys a village and kills civilians, it creates the foundations for the next wave of recruitment. Technology is also becoming a factor. Since 2023, JNIM has been developing its own drone capabilities, using inexpensive civilian equipment modified for reconnaissance and the delivery of explosives, and coordinating aerial attacks with assaults on the ground. But the Jainim is not the only major radical organization operating in the Sahel. The other is Islamic State in the Sahel, active mainly around the three-border region where Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso meet. It must be made clear from the outset that the two groups have little in common beyond a shared enemy. They compete for territory, local populations and trade routes, and their battles against one another have at times been bloodier than their clashes with government forces. Treating them as a single bloc would therefore be deeply misleading. For a Malian or Nigerian soldier, however, that distinction is largely academic. Pressure from the state may temporarily suppress their rivalry. An offensive by one group can open way for the other to move into abandoned territory, and both fight against the Malian army and Russian forces. Niger faces the most difficult position of all, because it is fighting two separate wars at opposite ends of the country. In the west, it confronts Jainim and Islamic State in the Sahel. In the southeast, around Lake Chad, it faces ISWAP and the remnants of Boko Haram. These are two unrelated theaters, more than 1,000 kilometers apart, each requiring its own forces. For that reason, it is the terrorist networks and the pressure they exert from multiple directions, not a unified jihadist command, that currently pose the greatest threat to the Sahel's juntas. And so until now, the entire story has unfolded within the borders of the three states brought together by a succession of coups. But jihadists do not read political maps the way we do. For them, the border between Burkina Faso and Benin is not the edge of the battlefield, but another gap to exploit. And beyond it lies what has been long regarded as the peaceful part of West Africa, the states of the Gulf of Guinea. Jainim's expansion toward the Gulf of Guinea did not begin with a vast column of fighters marching out of Mali, in the manner of Russian columns in Ukraine. The organization advances in stages. It first consolidated its influence in Mali and Burkina Faso, and then began moving southward across the continent. Crucially, clashes are now occurring regularly along the Burkina Faso-Benin and Burkina Faso-Togo borders. In Benin, Jainim is no longer limiting itself to using areas outside the cities as a rear base. The organization is attacking the military and trying to embed itself in local economies on both sides of the border with Niger. It conducts propaganda operations, builds relationships with local communities, and participates in illicit trade, including arms trafficking. The situation is similar in Togo. Ghana is a somewhat different case. It has not yet experienced a terrorist campaign comparable to those in northern Benin and Togo. But the absence of major attacks does not mean the absence of a threat. The northern regions may be used as logistical rear areas precisely to avoid opening another front. Nor do jihadists need to seize the ports themselves. It is far easier to strike the roads leading to Konotou, Lomé, Abidjan and Dakar. Disrupting transport can weaken both the coastal states and the AES juntas at the same time. For Jainim, economic warfare is often more effective than trying to hold a major city. It is important to remember, however, that there is not yet a continuous belt of territory under jihadist control stretching from Mali to the ocean. The phrase corridor of terrorism should be understood as a network of zones of influence, smuggling routes, and insecure areas. Jainim does not need to control every kilometer. It only needs the ability to move people, weapons, and money through Burkina Faso into Benin, Togo, and northern Ghana. Such a corridor is gradually taking shape. If Jainim and other groups are not stopped, this terror belt will expand over time and could eventually develop into something resembling a quasi-state. At this point, someone may ask, why is the West doing nothing? First, the French indeed tried and were rewarded by being expelled by the juntas. Second, we should understand that supporting the fight against jihadists in Mali now also means indirectly strengthening the junta and Russia's presence. Yet the complete isolation of Bamako makes it easier for Jainim to gain ground and pushes the authorities into even deeper dependence on Moscow. The same dilemma applies to Burkina Faso and Niger. There is no simple choice here between good and evil. There are two threats, and both must be contained at the same time. Repeating Operation Barkhane in its previous form is not realistic. France no longer has the political mandate to return, while other European countries remember both the failure of the Sahel missions and the experience of Libya. The end of Barkhane created a vacuum that has never been filled, while Western efforts remain fragmented and poorly coordinated. So if the problem is real, rather than merely theoretical, what should Western states do before it grows in scale and begins to threaten their own societies, including through mass migration? It seems clear that NATO should not launch another large-scale intervention in such an unstable region. At the same time, the alliance must recognize that the security of Europe and North Africa forms a single connected system, through Russian presence, financial flows, migration and terrorism. NATO has adopted a plan for stronger engagement along its southern flank and appointed a special representative, but for now its main tools remain dialogue and cooperation at a general level. This is precisely where a new approach is needed. It cannot be limited to training a few battalions or transferring money to governments that do not control their own provinces. Nor can it focus exclusively on protecting Europe's borders. The Sahel needs intelligence support, secure transport corridors and air capabilities, but also the reconstruction of local administration, courts, schools and economies. Military action must be combined with political reform, development and efforts to counter radicalization. That would probably require beginning a stabilization mission. It would be a return to basics, but there are no viable halfway measures. It is therefore worth considering what a practical course of action might look if a genuine strategic decision were made to support the region and confront its radical groups. The first priority should be to stop the expansion toward the Gulf of Guinea. Benin, Togo, Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire need support before JNIM structures become entrenched, not after another front has already opened. That means intelligence, stronger border security, military mobility, protection of key roads and counter-drone capabilities. But support must also extend to local communities. The second priority is to rebuild regional cooperation despite the split between ECOWAS and the AES. Terrorist groups exploit borders, while states waste time on political disputes. Mechanisms are needed to share intelligence on the movement of fighters, arms trafficking, and financing. Maintaining channels of communication with the juntas does not mean endorsing their policies. It means preserving the ability to act where a lack of communication directly strengthens both Russia and JNIM. The third priority should be to target Russia's financial networks. Sanctions against individual commanders are not enough if gold can still reach intermediaries and acquire legitimate documentation as it moves through successive jurisdictions. What is needed is the identification of mines, security companies, transport operators, and refineries, together with far greater transparency in imports into the UAE and Europe. Russia's presence must be understood simultaneously as a military, economic, and information threat. The fourth priority is a return to the information battlefield. Russia won much of the contest over narratives in Africa by presenting every French failure as a proof of the superiority of its own model. Today the real balance sheet must be made clear. After several years of cooperation with Russia, jihadist control has not diminished. The death toll remains high and Mali has become the site of a sustained war. Finally, NATO and the European Union need to become more engaged, but without simply repeating past interventions. The alliance possesses enormous military capabilities, yet the worst option would be to re-enter the region without a political objective, and then withdraw again after several years. Almost as damaging, however, is the belief that absence carries no cost. We should be clear about what destabilization in the Sahel produces. It fuels the trafficking of weapons, drugs, and people. It drives displacement within Africa and then increases migratory pressure toward North Africa and Europe. Migrants should not be equated with terrorists, but armed groups do exploit the same routes, criminal networks, and forged documents. A further deterioration could drive larger migration flows and enable more sophisticated terrorist operations against Europe and North America. For now, the most likely scenario is not the emergence of a single jihadist state spanning the entire Sahel. Continued fragmentation is far more plausible. The capitals will remain in the hands of the Juntas. Russia will protect the regimes and its economic interests. Meanwhile, Jainism and Islamic State will expand their control over rural areas and transport routes. This arrangement could persist for years, while gradually spreading southward. That is precisely why Mali matters so much. It is the Russian Federation's main war front in Africa, but also the clearest demonstration of the limits of the Russian model. Moscow can keep a partner in power, but it cannot rebuild a state. It can secure access to natural resources, but it cannot halt Jainism's expansion. With every additional year of war, Russia's influence in the capital grows, while the government's control over the provinces continues to shrink. Europe cannot choose between supporting Russia's partners and abandoning the region to jihadist groups. It needs a policy designed to contain both threats. That will require maintaining contact with the AES, strengthening the Gulf of Guinea states, disrupting the financing of Russian operations, and rebuilding intelligence and reconnaissance capabilities. It will be costly and politically difficult, but continued inaction also carries a price. The greatest mistake would be to treat Africa, Russia, and Ukraine as three separate stories. Russia uses African resources to strengthen its war effort. It exploits security crises to push out the West, then presents itself as the only partner capable of protecting vulnerable regimes. Jihadist groups benefit from the same vacuum, expanding their influence toward the Gulf of Guinea. Unless Europe develops a strategy that addresses these connections, it will respond only when the threat has once again moved far closer to its own borders.